A very short background to OSCR. OSCR was formed on the back of a number of charity difficulties, scandals in Scotland in about 2002, 2003. OSCR itself was actually set up before the Act was in place. It was a very small office. And then the Act came in 2005. And there is a summary of the main functions of the Scottish Charity Regulator. Granting charitable status. Anybody who wants to be a charity in Scotland has to be registered with OSCR, which is different from England and Wales, where there is a threshold to that. Maintaining a public register of charities. Investigating apparent misconduct and facilitating compliance with the Act. So these would be the main areas, and I'm not going to talk in detail about any of those, but you can ask questions afterwards if you want. What I think is very important to know about the Scottish charity sector is its profile, because I think that really informs the way in which we as a regulator have to act. If you look at that slide, what you're seeing is that approximately 60% of all charities have an income of less than £25,000, so I don't know what that is in today's money, 28,000 euros, something like that. So they're tiny. The majority of charities are very small, volunteer run, or with one staff member, a very small cash flow. And I think that really, that kind of informs really the way you have to act. Many of the bigger ones will be cross-border charities, and the lead regulator on them is the Charity Commission of England and Wales. So we have a specific kind of a sector, and we have to take that into account when we think about how we want to regulate that charity sector. I'm not really going to go into the strategic objectives. I just thought I'd put them up for you. This is kind of what we say we're going to do. We're currently rewriting our corporate plan, and we're going to try and make it a bit more plain English so that it actually makes sense. But it's all about, regulating. It's about increasing public trust, charities that we can trust and that give public benefit. It's about making things straightforward as possible, and it's about being an effective and efficient organisation. So these are our things. What I want to talk about, what I thought might be interesting, is kind of what I call getting the balance right. And I just thought that was a pretty picture. It's got nothing to do with the charity regulator at all. Why is the charity regulator there? What are we there to do? We're there to inspire public confidence in the charity sector. We're there to make sure that these scandals, or to try and make sure that these scandals don't happen again. And there are various ways of trying to do that. I'm going to talk a little bit about, and many of you may have read some pieces of work by Malcolm Sparrow, who's done a lot of work on models of regulation. And they tend to sometimes be separated into two different things, or a continuum, whichever way you want to see it. But you've got the kind of enforcement model. You've got the being reactive, being adversarial, being strict, being seen to be tough on the sector to respond to these incidents and to make sure that the public know that they're not going to happen again. Or you've got the preventative model, where you're trying to assist compliance, where you're trying to facilitate compliance, where you're trying to partner with the sector, where you've got more soft skills. Sparrow's point is that, of course, that's not a dichotomy. It's a false dichotomy. And in fact, what the regulatory craft is, what the regulator needs to try to do, is to look at what the real problems are within the sector and look at the different tools that you need in order to deal with these very specific problems that may exist. And he calls that the regulatory craft, and he talks a lot about using the right tool. You don't use a puncture repair kit to fix an aeroplane. You need the right tools to actually fix the problems that you have. So you don't need to have one or the other. You need to have a mix depending on the problem that you're dealing with. And I think understanding the sector in Scotland is very important when you think about this. And I'm going to go through three different sets of problems that we might have. Because the sector is so heavily weighted towards small, fairly informal, often very passionate, often very effective organisations, but they don't have very many resources, there's a real problem sometimes with compliance, but not because people don't want to comply. There's actually quite an appetite to comply, but because they don't really have the time, the energy, the skills to do it. Actually, it's not often the skills, it's more the time and the resources to do it. And what might seem simple from inside, sitting in your nice office overlooking the River Tay, might not really look so easy to somebody sitting outside who's maybe also got to report to some other body as well. So basically, for that sector and for our sector as a whole, being facilitative, trying to find ways of making it as easy as possible for charities to comply is extremely important, because otherwise what we're doing is we're really using a tool that is not fit for purpose. We need to have a tool that will allow these organisations to comply in the easiest way possible without losing, you know, our role as regulator. However, at the same time, we know there are charities out there that are maybe so incompetent in the level of governance, or so they may be at it. There are charities out there who have been formed for a different purpose, tax, for instance. And so we need to then be very strong. We need to respond to concerns, and we need to show that we're able to do that we have teeth, and that when we respond, we have to really make sure that the public know that we're responding, and that they can see that our response has had an effect and has had an impact. So there, we're acting much more in an enforcement way. We're being strong. We're showing that we can be trusted as a regulator to deal with the bigger problems. And then there's another set of problems, and that is really to do with when there's a set of organisations that maybe have characteristics in common that may pose a specific regulatory challenge. And I don't know how much it would have made press over here, but OSCR's done quite a bit of work on schools that have charitable status in Scotland. And that was quite a big piece of work and quite a politically sensitive piece of work, but it was felt that it needed to be done because they had been inherited onto the register from the revenue, as was, and then we had to kind of look and see if they really still fit the public, the charity test. And that has elements of both being facilitative and being an enforcer, because we had to say to them, well, if you don't do this, then you will be taken off the charity register. And many of these schools have had to change their practices quite significantly because of the work we've done. So there's different issues and there's different problems that the regulator is facing, and the tools that you use to try and deal with these problems have to fit each of these different scenarios. I think when OSCR was young, it invested quite heavily in being more of an enforcement regulator to show that it was, worthy of respect and so on, which made a lot of sense. And it's now that we're more comfortable in our skins that we're able to be a little bit more, well, actually, with our sector, we really need to look at how we can actually facilitate that compliance. I think one of the most important things when you're trying to develop that regulatory craft is that you have to be really a learning organisation, because some of these issues are actually quite tricky. What does it mean to build public trust? How do you measure that? How do you actually see whether or not your actions are kind of contributing to that? We know in our recent surveys that people think regulation does lead to public trust, but they don't necessarily know that the regulator exists. So what we actually do, you have to be a learning organisation. You have to have a strong kind of research focus, whether it's internal or external. You have to draw on that information in order to hone your craft and to make it fit for purpose. And I suppose the final comment really is about how you go about designing that overall set of tools that you are going to use. If you are going to be a regulator that responds to your sector appropriately, that can actually regulate through different means, you can't treat everything in the sector in the same way. And so it means you have to have a kind of subtle understanding of that sector and a very good, in-depth, profound understanding of the risks that you need to be dealing with as a regulator. And so one of the main things that we are trying to do now is to be more risk-led in our work. So from treating the whole sector the same, which is what we did at the very start, to saying, actually, that doesn't really make sense, because in fact there are other issues that are more specific to certain kinds of organisations or to certain kinds, at certain times in certain years, different kinds of risks will evolve. So we need to think about that, think about building a risk framework for the organisation and using that to guide the work. So I'm actually just going to finish now and just say that really I think overall I think it's very exciting for a regulator to be getting going when perhaps there's other ones that are fairly young who have gone through that learning process. We're 10 years old next year. So I think that we feel this is a very great opportunity to kind of start at the very beginning, honing that craft of regulation and really trying to respond to a sector that is probably in some ways quite similar to the Scottish sector, but will have its own very specific differences. So thank you very much. Thanks for inviting me today.